Welcome to the semifinals of policy debate at the state championship. So first, we have a couple quick announcements we want to make before we get started. First, a huge and massive congratulations to both of the teams who made it here. It is unimaginable a year ago to think, oh, there's going to be a state tournament next year and it's going to be online and it's somehow going to work. To maybe some of the most resilient debaters ever in this activity, I want to first congratulate our first semifinalist team for making it. If I butcher your last names, I do apologize. But we have the team of Edelstein and Ursini Rodriguez. So congratulations for making it to the semifinal round. And also congratulations to the other semifinal team, Olshan and Shirts. I know it's going to be a great debate. And we also want to thank our wonderful judges for competing. You're not competing today, for judging today. So I just want to give a shout out to you, and feel free if you want to quickly wave your hand. Also, if I butcher your name, I do apologize because I've never met any of you, which is kind of the fun thing about us being virtual. So first, thank you to Alex Cha for judging this round. Thank you to Emma Kalmbach for judging this round. Thank you to Nishad Neelakanadian for judging this round. Thank you to Hunter Toes for judging this round. And thank you to Sadaf Zohar for judging this round.
All right. Then the one I see you'll start now. Contention 1 is meeting the stock issues of inherency and significant harms. The federal rules of evidence determine what forensic evidence is allowed in courtrooms. Unfortunately, the federal rule of evidence 702 currently is too lenient and allows bogus pseudoscience to criminalize thousands of innocent people. Thus, the plan. The United States federal government should enact substantial criminal justice reform in the area of forensic science to the federal rule of evidence 702. The act solves bad forensic evidence being permitted in courts by making 4 changes to Rule 702. Currently, Rule 702 lays out 4 standards, but merely says the judges should consider them. Our plan would explicitly require all 4 to be met. Our plan would add a reliability requirement for evidence in courts and explicitly require objective testability and scientific methodology. Finally, it would establish a clear standard for how lower courts should treat the new rules, preventing courts from ignoring the changes. Bernstein 15 writes, courts omit expert testimony based upon misapplied methodologies, unreliable factual foundations, and untestable ipse dixit. The Supreme Court is ill positioned to solve this problem. The answer lies instead with the Judicial Conference. Each of the conflicts discussed above could be resolved through the following amendments. The first proposed language change removed the any-step standard from the current advisory committee note to the text of the rule. By explicitly requiring trial courts to address each of the 4 steps, the revised rule would unambiguously reject the looser standard. The second proposed language change would place a reliability requirement for an expert's factual predicate within Rule 702, rather than counting on trial courts to reach such a requirement from a combination of Rule 702B, 702C, and Rule 703. This question involves whether this is the type of fact upon which experts in the field would reasonably rely, and whether the expert considered enough of the relevant facts. The third proposed language change would incorporate the Supreme Court's requirement of scientific methodology into the text of Rule 702. The requirement of objective testability will provide an independent standard by which courts can make consistent rulings. Finally, the proposed amendment would add 2 provisions to help ensure that courts properly apply the rule. The first provision would codify the abuse of discretion standard. The second provision would expressly preclude courts from ignoring the plain language of Rule 702 and preference for prior judicial rulings that adopted different standards. And our plan would allow judges to screen out bad evidence rather than leaving it up to juries who are often scientifically illiterate. Bernstein 15 writes, once that validity is demonstrated, other liability issues go to the weight, not the admissibility of the evidence. Courts have held that the reliability of an expert's application of his methodologies and issues all solely for the jury. Courts mistakenly believe their discretion to admit expert testimony, even if one or more of the 4 steps are not satisfied. And the asks also conflicting rhetoric of contrary cases. Bernstein 15 writes, the court largely to bear with conflicting rhetoric that left ambiguous whether the case should be interpreted as establishing a strict or lenient standard of admissibility. The court expressed optimism about the capabilities of adversarial process and of the jury, and spoke of shaky but admissible evidence. And the aff is sufficient to solve. Bernstein 15 writes, the 2000 amendments to Rule 702 have not succeeded in entrenching these requirements. This is far from the only circuit court opinion to ignore amended Rule 702 and in favor of more lenient admissibility standards. Courts have continued to resist a revolutionary change in the way federal courts address the admissibility of expert testimony. Continued divisions among the federal courts over the proper standards for admission of expert testimony have resulted in the uneven administration of justice. This article proposes to remedy the inconsistent enforcement of an expert testimony gatekeeping via a new amendment to Rule 702. Part 4 proposes specific revisions to the language of Rule 702 that will remove any perceived ambiguity about trial courts' gatekeep responsibility. This will finally put an end to the judicial resistance to gatekeeping that has persisted since the Supreme Court decided Dober. And the impact is the criminalization of tens of thousands of innocent people convicted on junk science. Stacel 18 writes, junk science puts innocent people in jail. If you think maybe 1% of convicted defendants may be innocent, we're talking about tens of thousands of innocent people. Bite mark evidence is junk science, but police still trust bite marks. Other techniques are even less accurate. If somebody comes in a white lab coat, that's good enough for government work. Judges should ban junk science from courtrooms. And flawed forensic science contributes to 45% of wrongful convictions in the United States. Roth 20, misapplication of forensic science contributed to 45% of wrongful convictions in the US, and 120,000 innocent people are in jail. Roach 14. The Innocence Project estimates 120,000 innocent people could currently be in prison, and the DOJ criminalizes thousands of people. Smith 16 writes, there is scant scientific underpinning to a number of forensic practices that have been used for years to convict thousands of individuals in criminal cases. The US Department of Justice has indicated that it will ignore the report's recommendations, and most states copy the federal rules. The app solves most states' rules of evidence. Forensic Science Simplified 13 writes, while the states are allowed to adopt their own rules, most have adopted or modified the federal rules, including those covering expert testimony. Contention 2 is meeting the stock issue of topicality. This contention explains our mechanisms and argues that it would be topical. The mechanism of the affirmative is using a body called the Judicial Conference to make changes. They are part of the judicial branch and they create rules which Congress has months to veto. If they don't veto it, the change becomes law. The Judicial Conference is a policymaking body and enacts things. It's not an agency. The U.S. District Court 11 writes, the Judicial Conference is a policymaking body composed of federal judges, and it acts as an auxiliary of the courts. It is not an agency. The Judicial Conference enacted regulations, and the Judicial Conference is not a court. Lippmann 18. The Judicial Conference is not a court. And it enacts legislation, Harner 20. The program is dedicated to making this new legislation work that the Judicial Conference enacted. And the Supreme Court agrees, Justice 88. Because the federal rules of evidence are a legislative enactment, we turn to the traditional tools of statutory construction. And Congress is delegating enacting authority, and the act triggers no congressional infighting. Cavallaro 07. The Rules Enabling Act is a complete delegation to the judiciary of the legislative process with respect to such rules, with only a supervisory approval role reserved for Congress. Congress was entirely passive with respect to the rules enactment. And SCOTUS did the same thing in the Dober decision, citing past cases, Justice 93. We interpret the legislatively enacted federal rules of evidence as we would any statute. Rainey provides all relevant evidence is admissible, except as otherwise by rules prescribed by the Supreme Court pursuant to statutory authority. And this is not debatable. The Rules Enabling Act, which give power to the Judicial Conference, just directly says it's an enactment. The Yale Law Journal 08. When Congress passed the Rules Enabling Act, it deferred to the court's institutional expertise to enact guidelines for judicial procedure. And contention 3 is framing. When deciding the round, you should opt for impacts that are more probable, rather than ones that rely on many things all happening in conjunction, given that each thing that needs to happen makes the odds of them all happening less likely. Canada 98. Even the most far-fetched scenarios comprise a number of links, which may seem probable given the one before. Likelihood of the scenario dwindles with each step. The impression is one of plausibility. Omitted are the many branches of each step that would lead to a neutral outcome. Statements of probability matter. Uncertainty hawks flood our concern with a horde of dangers to pass non-zero probability. And prioritize probability. Kessler 08 writes, the highest degree of improbability becomes irrelevant as the measure of loss goes to infinity. In contrast to risk framed with logical probability, the logic of catastrophe does not attempt to provide means of absorbing uncertainty. Absurd scenarios gain plausibility by constructing a chain of potentialities. And making people better off makes society more equipped to solve the world's biggest problems. Kashmarek 17. An indirect approach to lowering extinction. We could reduce existential risk by indirect means and improve the worse off. This would contribute to existential risk reduction by curbing the negative ripple effects reaching wider as time passes. And the affirmative is not controversial or politically contentious. Barco 13. The public is unlikely to pay attention to details of reforms. If particular changes improve forensic science, the public may not notice. And Rule 807 has already been changed, which proved changing rules of evidence doesn't cause any undesirable outcomes. Roberts 19 writes that federal rules of evidence are amended to include an amendment to Rule 807. And future amendments are coming. USC no date. December 1st, 2020, Appellate Rules 35 and 40, Evidence Rule 404. December 1st, 2021, Appellate Rules 33, 6, 42, and Forms 1 and 2. December 1st, 2022, Appellate Rule 25, Criminal Rule 60. And I'm now open for cross.
Okay, are you ready to start?
Yep.
I want to start with your Warlick evidence. You say that 100,000 innocent people could be in jail right now. What evidence says that your AF is able to resolve that?
We don't release people from prison that have already been imprisoned.
So 100,000 people are in jail, they're innocent. Your affirmative does nothing to address that.
No, we do not release them from prison.
Okay, so
Though we
you
do
just kind of
prevent-
gave us the statistic and said that
No,
some people are in
it's sort of
prison.
a benchmark. It stops like thousands of people from being wrongfully incarcerated every year.
Okay, so does the AF only apply to future cases, or does it get retroactively applied to people who have been falsely convicted?
It does not retroactively apply, given that it's nearly impossible to determine when Rule 702 was used to convict someone. It'd just be like literally impossible to do so.
Your Bernstein 15 evidence says that you force judges to follow certain standards. Can you explain what those standards are?
Sure, they're outlined in the first Bernstein 15 evidence. This first card's really good on this question. I could go through all the changes we make. First,
what are the main standards?
Yeah, Matthew, if you want to explain the standards of Rule 702 specifically.
Yeah, so the first thing that it does is it moves the any step standard from the advisory committee note to the text of the rule. And so rather than merely saying that they should abstractly consider the 4 rules, it says that they explicitly have to meet all 4 rules. Second, it places a reliability requirement for an expert's factual predicate. And so it requires that the expert not merely use science to come to their conclusions, but that their conclusions are that the science is sufficient to warrant their conclusions. Currently, the law just says that the experts have to have used some amount of science, and so then they can overstate the claims that are supported by the science. Third, it incorporates the requirement of scientific methodology by requiring some objective testability of the expert's method. So it has to be vindicated by some objectively testable method. So for example, if a Dober motion was raised, they would have to demonstrate, for example, case studies where whatever evidence they used have proven reliable. And then finally, it makes 2 extra changes that ensure that the rule is properly applied. The first codifies the abuse of discretion standard.
All right, okay, that's been a lot. I think I understand generally what it does. How many judges are not applying these standards right now?
Well, AF doesn't make a particular claim on how many judges, but our evidence indicates that 45% of wrongful convictions are a result of misapplication of forensic science.
Well, if you're correct that the evidence is scientifically invalid and judges have the option to apply all of these standards right now, why are they not doing so?
Judges don't have the option right now. Judges apply.
Because this says that judges should consider all of these things. Why don't they consider these things when they can?
Well, I mean, the affirmative would change the things that they have to consider. One of them is the any step standard, but the other changes that it makes are key to solvency.
Are y'all taking prep?
No, the 1NC speech doc has been sent out. Whenever everyone receives the evidence from the email, I'll be happy to give an order and then begin my speech whenever everyone's ready. Perfect. So we'll begin with 2 off-case positions, that of topicality and that of a disadvantage. We'll then address their contention about framing, and finally, we're going to address their case specifically. Is everyone good for me to begin? Perfect. I'll get started. In our polarized political climate, there are no second chances. Before you pass a policy, we must ensure that it is the best possible way to resolve wrongful convictions. However, the affirmative would force controversial legislation through Congress, which derails any hope of repairing our nation's broken infrastructure. Moreover, they neglect to address structural issues in forensic science, like lack of qualified technicians and inadequate oversight. In this speech, I will present a topicality argument for why they do not fall within this year's resolution, a disadvantage to their proposal, and finally address the affirmative case. We'll begin with topicality. Enact must be a legislative action, which is common usage of the word. Eric Jaffe writes in 2000 that the use of the word enact corroborates only legislative actions. The Assembly can be presumed to have understood that common usage of enact when it selected it. The violation is that the affirmative uses the judicial conference instead of Congress. You should vote negative. First is limits. Court AFs explode the research burden to include infinite precedents, test cases, and grounds, and allows for AFs to generate entirely separate advantages from court action. Second is ground. They avoid the only topic generics like counterplans out of congressional action and politics, which moot clash and make it impossible to be negative. Next, we'll move on to the disadvantage. The thesis is that Congress is on the verge of passing infrastructure reform now. However, passing CGR is unpopular and causes political infighting. These partisan fights will derail negotiations, preventing infrastructure from being passed. Biden will pass an infrastructure bill now, but continued bipartisan negotiations are key. Brett Samuels writes in April 22nd, that the White House signaled that it would be open to talk with Republican lawmakers. The administration believes that the proposal is a legitimate starting point. The next steps will be conversation at the staff level between members of Congress. The president will invite members down to the White House. Biden said he'd be willing to discuss ways to fund the proposal. We are open to a range of mechanisms that could be done on a bipartisan basis. Criminal justice reform causes Democratic infighting and moderate defections. Wilkins writes in 2020 that Democrats have been spooked by Republicans' use of the bill as a leverage in the struggle for a coronavirus deal. It has had a chilling effect. Moderate Democrats are worried about appearing too progressive on crime. They are weathering accusations that they are soft on crime and want to defund the police, even if modest reforms do no such thing. Progressive lawmakers say postponing would be a big mistake. Investing in infrastructure is necessary to combat climate change and promote social equity. Adadero writes in April that addressing climate change requires focus on infrastructure, energy, and transportation. Investments are needed to build new systems to repair existing infrastructure. Infrastructure is closely tied to efforts to combat climate change. Transportation accounts for 28% of emissions. Biden's plan includes $621 billion for transportation, including incentives for electric vehicle adaptation. As sea levels rise, climate-adaptive infrastructure will be key. Communities of color are disproportionately impacted by repetitive flooding. Biden seeks to reduce these racial inequalities through tax credits to build homes in underserved communities and grant incentives for equitable zoning. Infrastructure can have profound effects on factors such as proximity to pollution, neighborhood impact health, while access to transportation impact education and employment. Now we'll move on to the case about their contention about framing. You should default to consequentialist utilitarianism. Gary Woolwer writes in 1997 that policies must be justified to those who pay the costs. Duties require that trade-offs are to the advantage of society. Deontological systems provide only general guidance and fail to address a problem or make it worse. A plausible link requires utilitarian ethics. Intentions, rhetoric, and piety are insufficient. You should also prefer specificity. They don't assume our eternal link chains or debate in which job arguments are true. Case defense also means that probability cuts both ways. You should hold the AF responsible for solving structural violence. Finally, in terms of their categorical evidence, you should make them prove a specific internal link from the AF to resolving existential risks. Even then, prioritize directly avoiding large threats because it's more quantifiable. I'll address their advantage proper. First is the turn. The alternative to setting up credible forensic evidence standards lets biased judges determine evidence usage in court case. Boas and Guerrero writes in 2018 that the Fryer standard was the prevailing rule, but it was supplanted by Daubert. It is designed to ensure greater caution. It made judges gatekeepers, tasked with blocking the entry of non-scientific evidence fraudulently presented as scientific info into the courtroom. Judges struggle with the investigation of the scientific aspects which the Daubert rule incorrectly classifies methodological errors, admitting evidence as scientific when it is not deserving. The aura of science can sway judges and jurors and lead them to overestimate the real probative strength of scientific evidence. Judges rely on experts who present them with the results of scientific tests, but judges rely on the experts almost without skepticism. The law is based on legal precedents. If a higher appellate court incorrectly admits a specific type of evidence as scientific, it sets a precedent for other courts, which will follow the precedent without re-examining the scientific reliability. Junk science could be found admissible by one court, and other courts would follow suit without engaging in the necessary scrutiny. This happened with hair, footprint, and voice comparisons. Even when scientists find that evidence are not grounded in science, many judges who are used on such evidence may have difficulty accepting conceding their own past mistakes. The chance of error always exists. Many kinds of forensic science are not based on research science, and there's little formal validation of their methods. Forensic experts tend to violate the most basic scientific principles that probabilistically estimate must be grounded in data. Next, on the stock issue of harms, false convictions for violent crimes are incredibly rare. Paul Cassell writes in 2018 that the FBI Uniform Crime Reports produces about 160 people wrongfully convicted each year in this country for a serious violent crime. About twice as many people are struck by lightning each year as are wrongfully convicted for violent crimes. A person is about 30,000 times more likely to be the victim of a violent crime than to be wrongfully convicted, and 15,000 times more likely to be a victim of robbery or assault. Second, they have no statistics for how many people are wrongfully convicted. Their evidence is entirely speculative, and they have no explanation as to how many they could solve. Third, flawed forensic science only applies to 45% of overturned convictions, not wrongful convictions overall. It doesn't mean that better forensics could exonerate the 120,000 people in prison now. Fourth, judges can already exclude invalid evidence under the Daubert standard. Christine Funk writes in 2020 that when scientific testimony is offered, the court must make an assessment as to whether or not the testimony is scientifically valid, including whether a technique has been tested, whether a technique has been subject to peer review, and the error rate of the method. The existence of standards in colleague operation, under Daubert, cross-examination, the introduction of contrary evidence, and careful instruction regarding burden of proof allow juries to properly evaluate evidence. Next, To solvency, their first argument is that they can't spill over to state courts because they uphold current standards and that they have no incentive to switch. Second, innocent people will still be convicted due to errors in DNA evidence, which is scientifically valid. William Thompson writes in 2003 that it is misleading to exclude human errors in DNA testing. False positives have occurred in proficiency tests and in actual cases. One example led to the false conviction of Timothy Durham. The jury convicted Durham of rape, and he was sentenced to 3,000 years in prison. The prosecution presented a DNA test that reportedly showed Durham's match the donor. 11 witnesses placed him in another state, but the jury rejected his alibi defense. The initial DNA test that helped convict Durham was proven to have been a false positive. The error arose from misinterpretation, and the laboratory was falsely incriminating an innocent man. Next, forensic experts often lie about the validity of their evidence. John Holdren writes in 2016 that expert witnesses can overstate the positive value of their evidence, going far beyond what the science can justify. Examiners testify that their conclusions are 100% certain or have zero error rate. Such statements are not scientifically defensible. FBI examiners provided scientifically invalid testimony in 95% of cases where the testimony was used to inculpate a defendant at trial. Next, there is no national body to monitor or accredit forensic laboratories. The National Science and Technology Council writes in 2014 that there is not a certification body or process for any discipline or category of forensic testing. The certification landscape for forensic science is fragmented, with inconsistencies apparent. There's no fully independent accrediting body exists to assess and give its imprimatur to worthy forensic science-related specialty boards that confer certification. Next, unqualified lab techs tamper with evidence which cause wrongful convictions. John Shoup writes for NBC in 2017 that prosecutors in Massachusetts dropped more than 21,000 low-level drug cases tainted by the work of our rogue chemist. Annie Dugan admitted to tampering with evidence, forging test results, and lying about it. Lab scandals have undermined thousands of convictions in 8 states in the past decade. The last card is marked at decade, and I'm open to cross-examination.
All right, I'll start time now. First on framework or on framing. Under your framing, are you multiplying magnitude times probability?
Yeah.
Okay. On T, does your evidence specifically mention Congress, or is it just legislative action?
The evidence makes the claim that an act exclusively refers to legislative action.
Okay. On the disad, when in the past has anything the Judicial Conference has done derailed another bill?
Sure. So the argument being made on disadvantage is that changes to federal rule of evidence require congressional approval during the approval denial period. We think that in the wake of things like the Chauvin trial, in which criminal justice is at the height of everyone's mind and it's the center of political controversy, there's an incentive in today's polarized climate to result in these sorts of things sparking backlash through Congress.
When in the past has something like that happened? Like the Judicial Conference's rules have sparked.
Well, the distinction being made is because right now criminal justice is far more polarized than it's ever been in the past. We're making an argument about how the status quo and the current focus on criminal justice for things like the Chauvin trial prove that right now is uniquely likely for these sort of things to spark controversy, especially when Congress has the capability and has to have a chance to overrule or not overrule each for it to rule.
That makes sense. On framing again, how do we determine what's a large threat or an existential risk?
I'm a little bit confused by the question. I think that we read compelling evidence on the internal link level and the impact level about the impacts of what not passing infrastructure would do and how it would affect tons of lives and structural conditions of
America. It's a framing question. It's not specific to the dissat. I'm just curious, like in general, how do we determine what's a large threat?
Well, I agree, but I think the context of disadvantage is really relevant to these questions because the debating done as the disadvantage and the specificity of our evidence and the ability for you to contest it is how the judges should determine the impact right now. We've read compelling evidence that makes the claim that the infrastructure bill will do a number of really good things for Americans across the country. We think that this is the large magnitude that should be prioritized.
On case, do judges just get to like ignore law? Like, can they just like skip through procedural things if they feel like it?
Which evidence are you in the context of? Because I feel like
this is the very first piece of evidence that says judges are biased.
Evidence talks about how judges are really bad at determining evidence uses in court cases. It broadly speaks to how judges may have a reliance on a forensic science that they now know are bad, but they still have a reliance on it, or that they just trust forensic scientists who claim that their methods are good unequivocally because they don't have a specific understanding of the process involved. It talks about how your affirmative's whole purpose is you make judges the gatekeeper of evidence. The Sangaro evidence talks about how that is a bad policy because judges are really bad at doing this.
All right. If judges are bad at in determining whether something is scientifically credible or not, don't you think the clarification of the procedures would result in less judge circumvention or misunderstanding?
Well,
and if not, what
the distinction this evidence makes is that judges are bad gatekeepers not because just they personally don't understand the things, but because they're willing to unequivocally trust these forensic scientists who lie about these sorts of things or exaggerate the effects of their treatments. We think that judges aren't capable of determining the validity under your standards that your plan implements because judges don't understand the science, they don't listen to the science, and they're set in their ways to the point where they aren't willing to accept new changes in forensic science. We think that your judges would be a bad implementer of your plan. It would implicate your solvency overall.
And final question, does your Cassell evidence make a claim as to wrongful convictions for non-violent crimes or just violent
The
crimes?
Cassell evidence talks about how unlikely wrongful convictions are. We think that this would extend to overall because it speaks broadly to how conviction rates for wrongful conviction rates are incredibly low in the United States.
All right, the 2AC has been sent. Order is the advantage, the framing page, topicality courts, and then the infrastructure disadvantage. Have people gotten it and are good? If anyone has not gotten it or is not good, stop me now. If not, I'll start in about 5 seconds. All right. Vote F to raise the Daubert standard so that forensic evidence in courts has to be peer-reviewed rather than just an expert's non-scientific opinion. Prison causes physical abuse, mental health issues, and ruins people's lives. The affirmative would solve this. 1, it requires meeting all 4 steps in Daubert, which Bernstein says are often not met by judges and result in large amounts of incarceration. 2, it requires judges to consider not merely whether the expert cited facts, but whether they cited sufficient facts to justify the conclusion. 3, it requires evidence to be objectively testable. 4, it makes 2 changes to ensure that the law is correctly applied by codifying the abuse of discretion standard and superseding prior judicial rulings. The line by line, their first argument is they say that judges are biased, but that's why the affirmative is necessary. There needs to be a clear standard because judges right now aren't applying adequate tests. The affirmative sets down a clear standard that is a legally codified term of art. It would require the witnesses to demonstrate studies that back up their claims, that prove that the evidence is reliable. And if the experts, or if the judges rather, come to wrong conclusions, then could be overturned upon conviction. Their evidence also admits that Daubert was better than Frye because Frye was too deferential to the judges. And so a new standard, which the affirmative is a more stringent version of Daubert, would be comparatively better. And the Bernstein evidence explains how we would be able to solve the issue of biased judges by applying a new standard. Bernstein agrees with almost every single one of their criticisms of current forensic evidence, but then goes on to explain how the proposal that we've given and that Bernstein has given is able to solve. They say that we can't overturn wrongful convictions. We don't claim to, but the Stossel evidence says we prevent thousands of people from being incarcerated a year. Their claim that wrongful conviction is very rare is just wrong. Between 3 and 5% of people who are incarcerated are innocent. Gould 10 writes, a 0.027% error rate is flat wrong and badly misleading. The numerator is likely many times larger than Markey estimates, and the denominator is several times smaller than he suggests. The denominator used by Markey should be contracted 50-fold. A true minimum innocence rate was at least 3.3%, potentially as high as 5%. And their evidence doesn't assume people who plead guilty based on forensic science. White 16 writes, the suspect sometimes confesses to having committed a crime in a manner consistent with forensic evidence. Unreliable ability of the pseudoscience undermines confidence in the confession. Pseudoscientific evidence may be even more likely than other types of false evidence to spur a false conviction because science is such a persuasive indicator of guilt. And 2,155 people have already been released. So that's a lower bound on wrongful convictions. Laughlin 18 writes, 2,155 people have already been exonerated of crimes they didn't commit. Innocent people spent over 18,750 years in prison due to error. They say judges already use standards, but Bernstein points out that the current standards are insufficient and don't have any of the changes and allow judges not to apply the standards rigorously. They say that the courts would not switch, but the affirmative requires courts to apply the new standard. And if in past cases evidence has been vindicated under the old standard, the last change that the affirmative makes would require them to apply the new test to the evidence that's already been vindicated, so we're able to solve that. DNA is not a solvency deficit because the affirmative requires it to have been correctly applied to the facts of the case. If there are lab errors or errors of other varieties, then DNA would not be admissible in a courtroom because it wouldn't have been correctly applied. Experts lying is a reason why the affirmative solves, because if experts lie to the judge, unless they falsify studies, in which case it would likely be overturned upon appeal, the evidence would be excluded from ever prejudicing a jury. But our evidence says that juries defer to the so-called experts because when a person comes in a white lab coat, they're likely to believe them regardless of the reliability of their conclusion. Lab accreditation is not a solvency deficit. There doesn't need to be one if there's a national judicial standard, which is what the affirmative changes. And the argument about evidence tampering is wrong because our affirmative makes it so that they have to correctly apply it. But even if you think that any of these solvency deficits decrease our solvency slightly, we're still accessing thousands of people being incarcerated, which is an impact that outweighs. Topicality courts. We meet this. Judicial conference changes to the rules of evidence or enactment. That's proven by the text of the Rules Enabling Act, giving them authority, the DeBaer case, the Rainey case, unanimous court judicial resolutions, and explicit congressional delegation. Their evidence is not about the judicial conference because there's not a scholar on earth who agrees with them that the judicial conference is not legislative. Their evidence says that it has to be legislative, but we've read 5 pieces of evidence that our process is a legislative process. However, if we don't meet, counterinterpretation changes the rules of evidence over-determine that they are enactments. Changes the rules of evidence are legally considered statutes by a bevy of Supreme Court decisions. Judicial conference changes the rules of evidence or their own unique legal phenomenon, which none of their evidence is about. Wiesenberger 92 writes, in Rainey, the Supreme Court stated the federal rules of evidence are a legislative enactment. This pronouncement is consistent with that made in numerous cases. The court has never fully explicated the underlying basis for its treatment in the federal rules of evidence as a statute. Federal rules of evidence were developed by a multi-branch process in which the subjective intent of the drafters is predominantly traceable to judicial branch. Enact means to make into law. The Frick Dictionary No Date writes to make into law, and congressional action or judicial conference change the rules of evidence are enactments. Sellers 11 writes, after a suggested amendment is developed, it can take up to 3 more years before a suggestion is enacted as a rule. Judicial conference makes rules into law. United States Court No Date writes, judicial conference approves amendments. Congress has statutory time period. Should enact legislation to reject, modify, or defer the amendment. Absent congressional action, the amendment becomes law. That's key. 1, for legal precision. We're more precise, which was above. That outweighs A, if the topic is the only predictable stasis point. Anything else justifies reading an affirmative from a different topic. B, the judge only has the jurisdiction to vote on the basis of the resolution. And C, absent a precise theory, their interp is entirely arbitrary and unpredictable. The fact that you could make up a better topic doesn't mean we should lose for not being compliant with it. Absent a precise definition being a requirement, it justifies counterinterp only RF or your interp plus RF. Second round, empirically, the negative is winning the majority of rounds according to a chart answered from Tab Room. Third, our interp excludes courts and agencies, which solves all their offense, given this is one of the only few acts with a solvency advocate for the judicial conference. And 4, you should use reasonability because competing interps is not reciprocal to the crime, overly punishes marginal abuse, and good is good enough. They have to win beyond a reasonable doubt that the affirmative is not topical for you to be willing to vote on this. Sorry, I just realized I skipped framing. Go to the framing page. That was my bad. Framing, you should prioritize probability and reducing structural violence. Structural violence accumulates over time and makes it harder to solve extinction. The people who are incarcerated, who the affirmative would stop incarcerating, could be the people who solve future existential threats. And as the measure of loss goes to infinity, it breaks decision making. You shouldn't be a consequentialist. You should try to protect people's rights, which are a side constraint on utilitarianism. Probability does cut both ways, but you have to prove the risk of the disadvantage as low. And the people who are no longer incarcerated are able to reduce the risk of extinction. The politics disadvantage. There's no link. The AF actor is the judicial conference. 1, they affect criminal law all the time and no one's heard of them. Cavallaro says Congress has always remained entirely passive. Judicial conference enactments. 2, the 2000 changes to rules of evidence 702 describing the Bernstein evidence definitely should have triggered the link. The fact that they didn't proves no one cares. 3, the dozens of other changes described by Roberts and USC Thump. 4, the AF is an obscure process that no one cares about. Wyden 16 writes, changes were developed by the US court system through an obscure procedural process for updating minor procedural rules. 5, there's never been a time in history when changes to one law have spilled over to ruin bipartisan support of another law. 6, Biden's governing strategy is laissez-faire. He's not at all related to the passage of bills. 7, Barkow says forensic science reforms slip under the radar. 8, the judicial conference isn't even political. Markham 20 writes, nonpartisan judicial conference. 9, the F is bipartisan. Bernstein 15 writes, gatekeeping against unreliable scientific evidence should not be partisan. Earliest calls for a crackdown on dubious expert testimony in toxic court cases came from liberal-leaning publication. The revolution began with the unanimous bipartisan Supreme Court opinion to bear. The advisory committee unanimous rules that the truth as amendment rule 702 notice an honorable agenda. I'm good for cross-examination.
Cool. Are you ready to begin?
Yes.
In the world of the plan, how do you determine whether or not there has been lab errors in the processing of DNA before the court case?
Well, the experts would have to demonstrate that they've correctly applied the science to the facts of the case. And so if...
Okay, so like the crime lab messes up, the DNA sample is incorrect. How does the standard, how do you test and prove that it was incorrectly utilized or there's been misapplied in this instance?
Well, the person against whom the DeBaer motion has raised would have to prove that there was not tampering of the evidence.
Okay, so how do they do that in the world in which crime labs right now are not accredited, there's no supervision, and people are basically doing whatever they want?
Well, I mean, they would have to provide evidence that no one had tampered with it. So, for example, if they had footage of the crime lab, if people were not tampering.
So to be clear, to convict anyone under your plan, you have to have every crime lab recorded, and then you have to go to the process of each crime lab to ensure that no tampering was done. How does the plan solve any of that?
Well, no, I mean, only in the case of a Dubert motion, and there are other ways of ensuring that the evidence is not tampered with. So, I mean, there are ways of looking at the samples for DNA. I'm blanking on the name of the test, but there's some test where you like combine some chemicals with it to see if it's been tampered with. And if like both of the chemicals produce a certain reaction, it hasn't been tampered with.
Okay.
I mean, I didn't know the exact process off the top of my head, but the Bernstein evidence articulates that there is a process
I guess
to determine if there's tamper.
Okay, I guess assuming that you're capable of determining these sort of things, how do you make it so that crime labs are efficient enough to process this effectively? Because I'm a little confused as to how this would operate in a world in which every single time you have to check in every crime lab to ensure no tampering goes down at any point of the thing.
Well, that's only in cases where a Dubert motion is raised. Dubert motions are not the most common, but
Okay.
I mean, it's not too difficult to check for accreditation. And if you make the argument that that would clog the crime labs, we'll answer that argument in the 1AR. The affirmative would, in fact, make the crime labs less clogged because right now, prosecutors are ordering a series of unnecessary forensic tests because they think that if they bring more bogus evidence into the courtroom,
I guess the next question, it kind of relies on judge discretion. In the world of the plan, judges have discretion to only like the studies have to be peer reviewed on first, but then judges decide as to whether or not they are actually entered into evidence and acceptable to the court, correct?
Right. I mean, judges are gatekeepers on evidence in courts right now, but the current standard is inadequate, such that they're quite
What
poor.
evidence have you read that says that judges would be able to effectively apply the new standards or understand?
Bernstein.
Where does it make the claim that in the world of the plan, it would be capable of judges effectively understanding which evidence is credible, what studies are credible, which evidence should be discarded?
A quote from the Bernstein evidence is, each of the conflicts above could be resolved through the following simple amendments. One of the conflicts that was discussed.
Well, I know it says that. I'm more asking about the warrant, because I mean, a lot of things can say a lot of things. I'm more asking about what evidence.
Well, you asked me where the evidence said it, and I told you where the evidence said
That's
it.
true. I guess that's a fair point. I'm more asking, where did the evidence, what reason for the evidence did it make here?
Yeah, I mean, it says that it would be a queer legally codified standard that could be applied. So, I mean, you can look at, is there reliable peer-reviewed evidence backing up this form of evidence? And if there is, then it can be all used in the case.
All right, sounds good. Thank you.
Are y'all taking prep?
Yeah, let me just start my timer and then we'll start prep. Jared, before I actually start, can you unmute on the call so it's not a waste of time? All right, that was 152 used. I'll send that in the chat. The only card I'll be reading was already in the 1NC doc, so you don't need to look for that. Sorry, let me just get arranged for 1 second. The order is going to be a brief overview, framing quickly, and then case, just kind of in the order of the 1NC. Is anyone not ready to begin?
Wait, sorry, the other card that you'll be reading, you said we're in the 1NC doc, just like where are you starting from the 1NC doc?
It's just the bottom card, the crime labs backlog argument.
Okay.
Okay. The issues in our forensic science system are structural. Judges are incompetent, vulnerable to misleading claims by forensic experts, regardless of the legal standards. Forensic laboratories are underfunded, unqualified, and unmonitored, leading to faulty results, even with scientifically valid techniques. The affirmative implements vague standards at the federal system, but fails to address the systemic issues that plague forensic science across our nation. Quickly, I will first address framing. In this round, you should prioritize balancing probability and magnitude and multiplying the two. That's the most logical way of making decisions because it's the only utilitarian and consequentialist way of evaluating risk. It ensures the most good happens for the most people and avoids prioritizing certain lives over others. Looking at probability alone is bad because it prevents us from looking down the road. If we only looked at the immediate effects of an action, that would lead to bad consequences down the road. Something might feel good in the short term, but that doesn't mean it won't ultimately have worse negative consequences, which are important to consider as a logical policymaker. None of their offense on this flow really applies because our disadvantage is about structural impacts like access to housing or climate change devastating families, which means that we access all of their framing better. Moreover, winning higher deficits to case than they're winning on the disadvantage and turns case arguments on the disadvantage also access all of their framing. With that, I will address the case. Our first argument is that a shift to judge control is bad. Our evidence from Boaz Sanjero, the head of the Department of Criminal Law, gives 5 warrants for why this is the case. First, judges fail to recognize methodological errors and can be easily persuaded by lying experts. They've said that judges have to realize that something is scientifically valid, but they cannot tell when someone is misleading them. That means the same faulty evidence is going to continue to be used in courts. Second, they rely on experts without skepticism in the same way that juries do. Just like juries see a person in a white coat, judges do the same thing and are therefore inclined to believe that evidence is reliable and should be accepted. Third, one wrong decision sets a legal precedent. If one judge in a high court makes a mistake and accepts a certain type of evidence, that means that lower courts adopt that precedent rather than reevaluating the quality of evidence. This has happened before, allowing lower courts to accept junk science like hair analysis, footprint analysis, voice analysis. Just one mistake allows faulty evidence to be accepted in all federal courts. Fourth, judges do not want to admit they're wrong. If they've accepted that evidence is credible and based in science in the past, they're not going to be willing to reverse their position on that stance, which means they're just going to continue to accept the evidence they have been for years. Finally, forensic experts just violate basic scientific principles in all of their studies and all of their techniques. Everything is unscientific and unbiased in data, which means that judges will have to accept some level of uncertainty and just exercise their discretion. Now, to all of this, they've said that they've created legal standards, but the standards are vague enough and forensic experts lie enough for judges to believe that they're complying with these standards, even if that's not actually the case. Second, false convictions are exceedingly rare. Our evidence from Paul Cassell, a professor of criminal procedure, says that 160 people at most are wrongfully convicted each year. And among that, most of them are not necessarily because of forensic science. You should prefer our evidence because it comes from the FBI's official crime reports rather than just speculations of how high the error rate could be. He goes on to say that twice as many people are struck by lightning each year than are wrongfully convicted for a violent offense. Now, they have read many pieces of evidence that there are many innocent people who end up in this prison system, but their affirmative doesn't even let any of those people out, so that's not offense that they can weigh. Moreover, none of their evidence says that forensic science is the cause of those wrongful convictions, just that wrongful convictions have happened in the first place. The only argument they have that still applies is people pleading guilty because of faulty forensic science, but police can still threaten and posture about having forensic evidence to coerce people into guilty pleas, even if they know that evidence would not ultimately be accepted in court. Third, judges already have the ability to exclude faulty evidence under the Daubert standard. Our evidence from Christine Funk, a criminal defense attorney with expertise in forensic science, says that under the Daubert standard, when testimony is offered, the court must decide whether it's scientifically valid, based on whether it's been tested before, whether it's subjected to peer review, and what the error rate is. Not only do they have the ability to consider these factors, but things like cross-examination, proposing contrary evidence, and instructing the juries mean that juries are properly able to evaluate how credible the evidence is. It may be true that some of the evidence is introduced anyway, but all of these contrary factors means it's not the reason why people are ultimately convicted. Fourth, they can't spill over to change state court practices. This was an argument that was virtually conceded in the 2AC. Because 90% of the criminal justice system takes place at the state and local level, simply changing the federal forensic science standards cannot solve for the majority of wrongful convictions. All of their evidence indicates that states are upholding current standards, and they're provided with no incentive to switch, which means they're going to preserve the faulty standards of the status quo. Fifth, DNA science will still convict people because of human error. Our evidence from William Thompson, writing for the Journal of Forensic Science, says that false positives are occurring because of human error, not the intrinsic validity of certain evidence. It gives the example of Timothy Durham, who was sentenced to 3,000 years in prison on the basis of DNA, despite having 11 witnesses placing him away from the crime scene. The issue wasn't DNA science, the issue was muddling within the lab. They say that this kind of stuff would be inadmissible under their plan, but it's not, because it's only evaluating the validity of that certain technique, not the validity of every single sample and every single case, which means human error is going to continue to put people in prison. Next, experts will simply lie. Our evidence from John Holdren explains that judges can still be persuaded by forensic examiners who tend to lie. The affirmative relies on judges consulting experts, but again, these judges themselves have no scientific expertise. Forensic examiners grossly overstate the quality and validity of their evidence. They'll claim that they're 100% certain of what they've said, that there's no error rate, and they might provide questionable studies that judges aren't good judges of to recognize whether they're credible studies or not. So even if the experts can't directly influence the juries, they'll be able to convince the judges in the same way. Next, there's no system of accreditation for forensic laboratories. Our evidence from the National Science and Tech Council explains that there is no certification body or process for every forensic laboratory. This allows unqualified and overworked people to work in forensic laboratories across the nation, producing flawed forensic evidence. Because there's no way to go into each of these laboratories and ensure that no tampering or scientifically bad methodology is going on, there's no way to prevent faulty evidence from being produced. Next, lab techs will simply tamper with evidence, causing wrongful convictions. Our evidence from John Shoup gives an example of one single chemist in Massachusetts who lied, tampered, and falsified results. Because of that, she was able to send 21,000 people to prison. Because of a lack of oversight, accreditation, and monitoring at the federal level, the people who are working in forensic laboratories are grossly unqualified. They will continue to produce faulty evidence, which is something that the affirmative plan simply cannot address. I'm good for cross-ex.
All right. In your previous speech, you made a series of arguments as to why the affirmative is not able to solve certain problems that we've isolated. So are any of these arguments things that the affirmative makes actively worse, or are these merely things that the affirmative can't solve?
We think our first argument about shifting control from juries to judges is actively bad. We've read evidence that juries currently do have the ability to determine whether or not something is viable or not. But when you shift it solely to judges, judges are easily swayed and therefore rely upon their own biases.
Okay, why are judges applying an objective standard that's laid out by the affirmative going to be more biased than juries who have no training in science and are not applying an objective standard of any variety and will generally believe people?
Every standard, no matter how objective you want to say the words are, has some level of discretion, has some level of subjectivity. So a judge can believe that something is credible, valid, whatever. They can believe what they're seeing and think they're following through with standards, without actually limiting bad evidence. There's no bright line for what it means for something to be valid or something to be objective or something to be proven. And moreover, if one judge makes a mistake, that sets a precedent for all future cases. So it only takes one mistake for bad evidence to proliferate through the system.
Just to clarify, the question was, so why are judges comparatively worse than the juries, regardless of the nebulousness of the standard? I mean, even if we say that the standard is just totally nebulous, such that it's giving total deference to the judges versus total deference to the juries.
Sure. So our evidence from Christine Funk gives a few warrants about why the current system is preferable. First, it says the Daubert standard allows judges to evaluate all of the things you're saying should be evaluated, like whether something is valid, subject to review, etc. But then it says juries are properly able to evaluate evidence because they have things like viewing cross-examination, seeing the introduction of contrary evidence, and careful instruction. And the combination of those factors means that they're properly able to evaluate evidence.
Sure. The Funk evidence seems to advocate for Daubert instead of the Frye standard. It says that
well, that's the status quo, so that's not advocating for your F.
Well, no, it's the status quo in I think 32 states.
It's just the status quo.
Well, there are many states, such as Oregon and some others, that apply the Frye standard still, and Funk is
your F doesn't spill over to the state systems, so I'm not sure what the relevant
is. So the Daubert standard is, the affirmative makes a stronger Daubert standard, and the Daubert standard is comparatively stronger than the Frye standard. The Funk evidence is pro-Daubert instead of Frye because they say Frye is too flexible of a standard.
No, the Funk evidence is speaking to the importance of juries being able to properly evaluate evidence by seeing things like cross-examination, contrary evidence, etc. And that's something that would be eliminated by the affirmative, instead shifting solely to judges who have no idea what they're doing.
Sure, the Funk evidence seems to be about why Daubert is better than Frye.
It might be better than Frye, but that doesn't mean your F is preferable to the status quo.
The evidence for the 1NR has been sent out. Whenever everyone receives it, I'll be happy to give the order and begin the speech.
I'm going to make a bold prediction that it'll be the infrastructure disadvantage.
Matthew, you got me once again. It'll be the disadvantage.
I'm still downloading it.
Yeah, sounds good. Just let me know whenever everything's set up for you. No rush.
Great. I'm good.
Perfect. Is everyone ready? Sounds good. In policy debate, we don't just look at what the policy does and the immediate ramifications of it, but what the consequences of the policy would be. As the name implies, policy debate is from the viewpoint of policymakers, which means that the affirmative team has to defend the political consequences of their plan. Even if the plan may feel good in the short term, it would have massive negative consequences down the road that would dwarf any possible benefits. Our nation's infrastructure is crumbling. Biden's plan would combat climate change, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and protect vulnerable areas from sea level rise. It would promote equity by investing in underserved communities and increase access to economic opportunities. Forcing criminal justice reform through polarizing congressional actions would be polarizing, disrupt fragile bipartisan negotiations, and make infrastructure reform impossible. You should prioritize the disadvantage over the affirmative for two reasons. First, it outweighs. Our plan impacts every single American, access to transportation, and combats climate change, which affect each and every one of us, which affects far more people than the people that could be possibly affected by the plan. It also turns case, because only through effective infrastructure can things like crime labs grow more effective, which can allow for more effective implementation of forensic science standards down the road. First, I'm going to respond to the link. They make a few arguments in the flow, which are all about how the judicial conference is obscure, which means there would be no political ramifications. This is a misunderstanding of the argument being made by the negative. We understand that your actor is the judicial conference. However, the link is the fact that FRE amendments require congressional approval, which in today's polarized environment would spark the partisan fighting. FRE amendments require congressional approval, Tedder 8. Amendments to FRE is transmitted to Congress for acceptance or rejection. Lawmakers have directly amended the rules several times, and Congress appears more inclined than ever to involve itself directly in the rules. FRE amendments empirically spark backlash, also from Tedder 8. The FRE sparked controversy because they were labeled substantive. Intense lobbying over the proposed rules led to modifications. New amendments flow upstream to Congress. In addition, these amendments are seen as politically driven, Tedder 8. When Congress decides to amend the federal rules of evidence, the process is anything but deliberative. It's based on reaction to major events, politically driven congressional process. This is really important because they aren't understanding why now is uniquely key for the polarization. In the wake of the Chauvin style, the nation's focus is directly on criminal justice, and these sorts of things that may not have seemed politicized before are now incredibly polarizing and controversial. If Republicans, in the midst of the peak of infrastructure negotiations, see it as Congress or the Democrats trying to force these sorts of legislative rules that would cripple these sorts of investigations in the status quo, it would be perceived as partisan and it was seen as politically motivated, which would derail infrastructure. Their next main argument is about how there have been a ton of amendments to FRE in the past, which means this disadvantage should have already occurred. First, all of the reforms they mention are minor procedural shifts, which is not the same thing as the affirmative, which changes the standard, which is not the same thing as what their evidence talks about. However, even if that wasn't the case, they misunderstand their argument about political realities, because even if they're right that back then it wasn't controversial, it doesn't assume the current state of American political discourse, which makes these sorts of things so controversial, as I explained above. Their next argument on the disadvantage is that there is no spillover from one bill to the next. However, this was 3 seconds in their speech, and they did not read a warrant or read any evidence for this. Our link is fantastic in speaking to how Biden's political capital is absolutely critical to the passage of infrastructure. He's the person who introduced the bill, and he's trying to get people on board for passage, which means that right now, he's going to get them on track. But forcing through partisan criminal justice is the exact sort of thing that derails negotiations and make it seem like in bad faith. The plan would render it impossible for these sorts of things to occur. Next, their next argument is that Biden is not related to the bill. Again, this is another argument that the 2AC says without evidence or a warrant for. Our argument, unique to evidence, is incredibly specific to the fact that Biden is pushing infrastructure right now, which is why it's capable of passing. However, even if that wasn't the case, the fact is that it also makes a claim. That the plan would spark partisan infighting, which means that in the world of the plan, any negotiations that are going on, even if Biden wasn't involved, would be entirely derailed. Their final argument on this disadvantage is that the plan would be bipartisan, which means that there would be no link. I'll explain the link here. Passing criminal justice reform polarizes Congress, which is the Wilkins evidence. Republicans tie reforms to calls like defund the police and being weak on crime, which alienates moderate Democratic senators like Joe Manchin. This disrupts fragile bipartisan negotiations over infrastructure, which dooms Biden's proposal. Criminal justice reform divides Congress. Republicans believe that it's weak on crime, while Democrats argue that it's not liberal enough. Jackson in Berman 21. The nation was shaken by police violence and racial injustice. Biden arguing for reform, while Trump billed himself as law and order. Biden will face immense pressure. On the left, he is hounded by racial justice advocates who assail his 1994 crime bill. On the right, police unions accuse the former senator of abdicating his alliance with law enforcement by backing reform. This proves that by pushing through polarizing negotiations, it causes fights which make it impossible for legislation to pass. Their only response to this, only evidence for this in the 2AC, was evidence that made the claim that things like Dauber standards should be bipartisan. Maybe forensic standards should be bipartisan, but the current political realities and the state of American discourse make it so that's not the case.
Right, we have 8 minutes starting now.
Stop prep at 3:05. The order is case and then the dissad. There are cards, or a card, but it was in the 2AC. It was sent out in the 2AC. If anyone is not ready, please let me know now. Or
Wait, I think one of the judges left and is taking a bio break.
I'm
I
back.
think all the judges are here, yeah.
Okay.
Is the other next speaker here? All right, sweet. All right. Then if no one objects, I'll start. On case, vote after raise the Dober standards so the forensic evidence in courts has to be peer-reviewed rather than just an expert's non-scientific opinion. Prison causes physical abuse, mental health, and ruins people's lives, and the affirmative solves that. 1, it requires meeting all 4 steps at Dober, which Bernstein says are often not met by judges and result in large amounts of incarceration. 2, it requires judges to consider not merely whether the expert cited facts, but whether they cited sufficient facts to justify the conclusion. 3, it requires evidence to be objectively testable. 4, it makes 2 other changes to ensure that the law is correctly applied by codifying the abuse of discretion standard and superseding prior judicial rulings. And Bernstein articulates how many of the structural issues would be resolvable by the affirmative. And our standards are not vague. Bernstein articulates a very specific standard. And a shift to judge control is a status quo. They already have control. And failing to recognize methodological errors is more true about the status quo. While judges can't apply perfectly, they're better than juries with no experts and no standards at all. And judges don't defer because they have to prove objective testability under the AF. And one wrong decision won't set a legal precedent because the affirmative requires reevaluation under the new standard. This was in the first piece of Bernstein 15 evidence. They can't cite previous cases as justification for accepting certain types of evidence. And while judges may not want to admit they're wrong, if they make a wrong decision, it will get overturned by higher courts. And the violation of basic scientific principles would be solved by the AF. They won't have to accept bad evidence. They have to prove their evidence is reliable. And the standards aren't vague. Objective testability is a rigorous standard determined by the Supreme Court. Judges still sentence people for murder with equally clear standards. It's a ridiculous argument. And false convictions aren't rare. Our evidence cites later studies debunking Cassell and prefer the 3 studies we've cited to DOJ propaganda, especially cited to DOJ propaganda, particularly when the Smith evidence on case says that the DOJ's later recanted their statement and agrees over 1,600 people have been incarcerated on a federal level alone. And Stossel says even by conservative estimates, the affirmative solves tens of thousands of innocent people who would otherwise be incarcerated. And our evidence also cites crime data, and the FBI has an incentive to not say innocent people are incarcerated. And the affirmative prevents a future incarceration, and Stossel says 10% are incarcerated per year. And the guilty plea is something that the AF doesn't solve. Their EV only looks at past exonerations, not the actual number. And the Dober standard is inadequate. We changed the Dober standard in the 4 ways articulated in the overview that makes it adequate. And juries don't evaluate well because they believe everyone in a white lab coat. The AF fixes that. And the affirmative does spill over. Forensic Science Simplified says the states generally follow changes to federal law. That was in the 1AC. And the affirmative solves DNA. If the evidence is unreliable and is inadequately applied lab errors, it wouldn't be adequately applied. It would be kicked out of the court. And the affirmative requires correct application, so human error would be rooted out. And experts lying isn't a deficit because they have to demonstrate objective testability. Overstating quality is a reason why the status quo is not sufficient and the jury is inadequate because the jury doesn't adequately test evidence like the AF would. And lack of accreditation is not a solvency deficit. The affirmative require evidence to be qualified in order to enter a courtroom. And Schuband advocates for reform very similar to the AF and is decisively affirmative on framing. Yes, multiply magnitude times probability. However, the risk of the dissad is so low that it's discounted, and both impacts matter under the framing. On the infrastructure dissad, a teeter is describing when Congress changes the rules of evidence themselves, not when they approve judicial conference amendments. And given that the plan makes the reform into the law and have congressional approval, and the dissad doesn't turn case because it's so unlikely, extend the framing arguments from the 1AC. And federal rules of evidence amendments don't require congressional approval. Congress usually does nothing, and if they do nothing, the rules become law. And the teeter evidence, the last time change cites the last time a change fostered backlash was in the 1990s, and our more recent evidence describes that the more charged Congress has been less interested in obscure little political rules. And the affirmative is not controversial. Bernstein is a very conservative person. He's the one who proposed the affirmative. It's specific to his bipartisan issue, and the previous changes are perceived as being the same as the affirmative, and they have no empirical evidence for spillover ever happening. They have the burden to prove this will happen, and that a disadvantage is asinine. Biden has no role in passing rules of evidence that doesn't go through the executive, and the evidence is about how Congress vetoing judicial conference rules, but we feel that doesn't happen, similar to how Congress asks don't have to defend the president vetoing or not. And their evidence saying Biden is pushing infrastructure about the administration, not Biden specifically. And criminal justice reform is bipartisan. No one ties reform to being soft on crime if they're about small changes to Federal Rule of Evidence 702, and none of their evidence is about forensic science because forensic science is very popular. In 2000, previous major changes prove there's no link, and Bernstein makes a descriptive claim that is bipartisan. If you read the context, he's using should in the descriptive sense, similar to say if I drop a pen, it should fall. I'm not making a moral claim, I'm making a descriptive claim. And our evidence describes a unanimous, bipartisan Supreme Court opinion on Dober. Their answer to our logical warrants about no spillover is such as to read evidence from political scientists and in political scientists click news articles, and the disadvantage doesn't outweigh other infrastructure to be able to solve the impact, and their evidence is all absurdly speculative, and none of their authors articulate the link. And other charge issues such as gun control and immigration policy should trigger infighting and take out the link. However, political scientists have no better track record than dart throwing monkey, Stevenson 12. My colleagues have failed spectacularly. Nansen Reagan's astrologer may have had superior forecasting skills. Political prognosticators fare just as poorly on domestic politics. Alas, little has changed. Professor Tetlock's main finding, chimps randomly throwing darts at the possible outcomes, are done almost as well as the experts. Researching into political predictions is doomed to fail. The idea is to predict more accurately than a dart-throwing chimp, and lawmakers will compartmentalize a conflict on separate issues. Kavanaugh approves. Program 18. Amid turmoil, Congress approved aviation policy, a measure to combat opioid abuse. Card abuse.
Okay. We have 6:08 left. I will start that. All right, the order is going to be the disadvantage and then the case. Is anyone not good to start? Okay. You should be voting negative in this round because the infrastructure dissad outweighs and turns the case. Biden's proposal will address climate change and social inequity on a massive scale. It'll reduce carbon emissions, protect communities from sea level rise, and provide equal housing opportunities to people of color. If you truly value reducing inequality or promoting racial justice, you must vote negative to allow infrastructure to pass. You should frame this debate through the concession of virtually every part of the disadvantage. They agree with our uniqueness, that the bill will pass now due to fragile bipartisan negotiations. They agree with the internal link and impact, that passage can dramatically improve lives of all Americans. That means that even a small risk of the link should be sufficient to vote negative given substantial solvency deficits on the case. You should not reward the 1AR for skewing analytics and tagline extensions without warrants. If your understanding of any of the arguments on this flow changes from the 2AR to the 1AR, you should not accept it because it's new. First, they say no link, but they've conceded the framing issue that was extended in the 1NR. Criminal justice reform is uniquely partisan. Just look to the trial of Derek Chauvin, where the entire nation is focused on criminal justice reform and the way the courts and general system handle it. Even if normally an FRE amendment would not be perceived as political, in our uniquely polarized climate, it certainly will be. Our Wilkins evidence explains that criminal justice reform polarizes moderates specifically, because even non-progressive reforms get spun as overly progressive and make moderates be scared that they get linked to defund the police. The Berman evidence says that it splits parties apart because progressives always want it to go further, whereas conservatives think it went nowhere at all, or where conservatives want it to go much less. Furthermore, amendments specifically link. Our Tedder evidence says that there's a period of approval or denial that Congress has to go through, which means that Congress does have to debate or at least consider striking down the affirmative. During that period, Congress members can backlash to criminal justice reform, and they see it as a politically driven change. Their evidence says that amendments should not be political, but it doesn't assume any of the current conditions of the status quo. All of the arguments about Biden are irrelevant. This isn't a question of political capital, but rather the will and bipartisanship in Congress. They say that other infrastructure will pass. This is a new argument and unwarranted. We've read evidence about our specific proposal. They say other issues thump. This is completely new and should be struck from the flow, but they've read no evidence at all. They say political scientists are bad, but it's not applicable to this question. It's not a question of predictions, but of political dynamics, which we've adequately described, which means there is spillover. We've read much more specific evidence saying that people hate criminal justice reform in the status quo, which disrupts any chance of bipartisanship on infrastructure bill, ruining its passage. Case. This debate should be a presumption ballot. It's not our burden to propose an alternative solution if we've won that the affirmative does not sufficiently address their harm of wrongful convictions. The status quo solves. The current system is balanced between judges and juries and is preferable to what the affirmative implements. Our Funk evidence says that under the current Dober standard, judges are already forced to consider the validity, error rate, and things like peer review. However, juries also play into this because they can be influenced by things like cross-examination, alternate evidence being presented, and close instruction of how to accept it or not. By having judges and juries both in control right now, there are more people that are regulating evidence in forensic court, which means that the evidence is more credible. However, a shift to judge control alone exacerbates biases and sustains junk science. That's the Sanjera evidence. Judges are easily persuaded by forensic examiners and fail to recognize systematic errors. The Holdren evidence says that forensic examiners are just going to lie and overstate the quality and validity of their evidence. Judges are just as influenced by the white coats as juries are, and by having fewer people in charge of determining whether evidence is acceptable, you raise the risk that bad evidence comes into court. Furthermore, they've conceded that judges don't want to admit that they're wrong. So if they've admitted bad evidence in the past, they'll continue to do so. And when they do admit bad evidence, they set a legal precedent, which means that other courts will continue and follow and do the same things that they did. Second, false convictions because of DNA are exceedingly rare. The Cassell evidence says that it's under 160 per year and that more people are struck by lightning. Even if they were wrong that there are more people, the affirmative doesn't let anyone out of prison, and none of the statistics they have say that wrongful convictions are on the basis of DNA, so that's not a problem they can solve. Moreover, they conceded that plea bargains can still happen on the basis of bad forensic science because police can still say that they found evidence and use that as a coercion tool. That means that people will still plead guilty on the basis of bad forensic science causing wrongful convictions. Third, they can't spill over to states. Not a single piece of evidence says that the states would agree with this change. Rather, they model the current system and would maintain that. That means that 90% of the problem, which is occurring at the state level, will continue after their plan. Finally, no oversight means that faulty evidence will still be accepted. Because of no accreditation and no monitoring, cases of human error or cases of lab abuse will continue to happen. The problem isn't legal standards, but the inability to monitor or enforce them.
All right, we have an amount of time that I wrote in the chat. We have 3:05. Take that now. Right. The order is going to be the advantage and then the infrastructure disadvantage. Is anyone not ready? Right. If anyone's not ready, say something. Otherwise, I'll start in about 5 seconds. Right. Vote F to raise the Daubert standard so that forensic evidence in courts has to be peer-reviewed rather than just an expert's non-scientific opinion. Prison causes physical abuse, mental health issues, and ruins people's lives. The affirmative solves this. They've conceded our causal account of how the affirmative solves it. 1, it requires meeting all 4 steps in Daubert, which Bernstein says are often not met by judges. And Bernstein makes the causal claim that if these 4 steps were met, it would be able to solve. 2nd, it requires judges to not merely consider whether the expert cited facts in the first place, but whether they cited sufficient facts to justify the conclusion. 3rd, it requires evidence to be objectively testable and have been verified. current evidence like bite mark has not been verified by studies, so it would be kept out. And 4, it makes 2 other changes to ensure the law is correctly applied by codifying the abuse of discretion standard and superseding prior judicial rulings. Now, I'll do the line by line here. Their first argument is they make the claim that if the affirmative is not sufficient to solve, then you should vote negative regardless of the disadvantage. Yet this is a wrong-headed way of thinking. The perfect should not be the enemy of the good. If the affirmative prevents innocent people from being incarcerated and from being permanently separated from their family, they face physical and mental abuse, that is a good thing. Even if we don't prevent tens of thousands of people, if we prevent even hundreds of people from being incarcerated, then you should still vote affirmative because this type of violence matters to the people who the violence is being inflicted to. They say their next argument is that there's already a judge who screens out bad evidence. But our Bernstein evidence indicates that currently the judge under the Doe-Bear standard is insufficient because currently judges, they only have to meet one of the 4 standards, and judges are given too much discretion. They don't have to look at whether the evidence has been verified by scientifically rigorous procedures. They just have to look at whether the expert says that it's been verified by scientifically rigorous procedure. Their next argument is that experts can lie, but if they lie, that would not be, the affirmative would exclude it, because if they're lying, then they would not present rigorous data. And if the people were lying to the judges and there's a mistrial, then there would be a future trial as a result of the trial being overturned in the future. And their next argument is the assertion that that exoneration is rare, but this evidence is just wrong. We've read 4 pieces of evidence that indict their study. They've conceded their study is from the Department of Justice, who has an incentive to deflate the numbers because they don't want to be held accountable for the large number of people being incarcerated. Furthermore, they've conceded the Smith evidence, who indicates that on the federal level alone, thousands of people are being incarcerated, and cites a later Department of Justice report. Our evidence postdates theirs and indicates that theirs is unreliable because it does not take into account factors such as the absence of plea bargaining, and it only looks at the people who have been exonerated, not people total. Their argument about the legal precedent is wrong. Or the affirmative would change the standard such that if evidence has been verified in the past, it would still have to be applied under the new standard because the affirmative changes the standard. The last provision that we make would make it so that old evidence, even if it's been verified in the past, would not automatically be let in. Yes, the affirmative spills over the states. Forensic Science Simplified says states copy the federal rules. And even if we don't, thousands are incarcerated on the federal level alone. The arguments about no oversight do not matter. Regardless of whether there's oversight of labs nationally right now, the affirmative is able to solve bad evidence entering a courtroom by requiring objective testability. Lab oversight is not necessary for any part of the solvency, the infrastructure disadvantage. There is no way on God's green earth that the affirmative would have any impact on the stimulus. They've conceded many arguments. First, there's no spillover. They could not name a time in history when changes to one bill have spilled over to derail a separate bill. Even if they're correct that the affirmative would be controversial, just because something's controversial does not mean that it would derail the stimulus. And this has never happened in history, and the program evidence says this, and the program evidence was dropped by the 2NR. This zeroes the disadvantage because they said the way they've articulated it, Biden has nothing to do with it. So it has to be about congressional fights, and yet they've conceded that no congressional fights spill over. Second, the Stevenson evidence says that precise predictions about politics are impossible and have no more reliability than the predictions made by dart-throwing monkeys. And so you should be very skeptical of all of the claims about how the bill is going to pass and these precise predictions about how the affirmative will change it. We have no reason to think that because these predictions are historically unreliable. Third, their evidence is citing backlash, but the last time there was backlash was in the 1990s. Cavallaro says that more recently, the courts have remained entirely passive. Four, the affirmative is bipartisan. Bernstein is much better than their evidence because it's specific to the affirmative. Fifth, we feel that Congress approves the policy, similar to how Congress feel that the executive doesn't veto. We feel that Congress doesn't veto, and their evidence is about congressional changes going against it, not the other things. Six, other bills such as gun control and immigration are far more controversial. Should have traded the link. This wasn't new in the 1AR because it was in response to a block argument that the current political context is different. Good debate, y'all.
Yeah.
Perfect. So once again, congratulations to all of our debaters for making it this far. That is wonderful. And the fact you made it here to the semifinals, like I said before, during a pandemic year when last year the state tournament was canceled, just shows how resilient and how talented each and every one of you is. So the decision is a 5-0 decision for the negation. So congratulations to the negation for advancing, and congratulations to the affirmation for making it so far. If the judges want to explain their decisions, we definitely have time to do that. So if they want to go and each give some feedback, that is more than welcome.
Yeah, does anyone want to go first? I know I am muted, but I don't need to say anything first. I'll be fast. I think for me, the disad was a wash for me. I think both were real, like both had good arguments, and it kind of just ended up with this wash. It ultimately came down to solvency for me, and I think the NAG did a good enough job showing that even with the AF's plan, that the solvency still wasn't there, just with like police being able to lie about, forensic evidence, which is a systemic issue as well. And that standard doesn't necessarily mean that the standard would be like followed correctly, like even if they go through all the steps. So I think the NAG casted enough doubt in the realm of solvency to get the win.
For me, it was really similar. I think that the specific argument from the NSTC was what sort of was the linchpin for me going for the NEG. I think that if you had been able to tell me how there would have been some sort of oversight accountability for people following this process, it would have made it a lot easier. But you didn't give me a sufficient answer to it, so that's what ended up happening.
I agree with the previous two judges. For me, it came down to that the NAG side were able to paint a very clear picture of how things would function with evidence in courts, and just kind of brought the evidence into just a real picture for me, and it just made it more convincing. But great job on both sides. It was very close.
Yeah, I don't know if
Yeah, great job for both of you teams. And I was just slightly more convinced by Beth and Jared because they sounded more realistic, like they got more closer to the reality and the issues of current these days. So it just got to me a little closer. So yeah, but both of you did a great job. Congratulations.
Okay, I don't see the other judge here, so I think good job. It was I echo, it was a great debate. Really enjoyed it, and good luck in the finals.
Yes. Good luck in finals, y'all. And good
Good
debate.
luck,
Thank
y'all.
you all so
Good
much
debate.
for
Thanks for
judging,
judging.
etc.
Great
Great job, all of you.
Thank you, everyone.
Good luck going forward.